$25 billion did not leave America quietly. It didn't leak out over years. It didn't wait for elections. It moved in days. And when capital moves that fast, something is already broken. This was not a strike, not a recession, not a technological failure. It was a policy failure, one so severe that America's largest automaker decided uncertainty was more dangerous than relocation. I want to be very clear with you tonight. This is not a story about loyalty. It is not about patriotism. It is not even about General Motors. It is about what happens when governments confuse pressure with strategy, chaos with strength, and threats with economic planning. For decades, I've studied how nations win and lose the competition for capital. The rule is always the same. Investors tolerate risk, but they flee uncertainty. And when uncertainty becomes policy, exit becomes rational. If you care about jobs, wages, or the future of industrial economies, you need to understand this moment. Stay with me. Share this if it matters to you. Because before we talk about consequences, we must first understand the system that produced them. To understand why this moment matters, we have to strip away the noise. Forget the press statements. Forget the outrage. Forget the political theater. At its core, this is a simple question. Can the United States still offer a credible environment for long-term industrial investment? Not speeches, not promises, an environment. Industrial systems don't respond to emotion. They respond to rules, to timelines, to expectations that remain stable long enough for capital to commit, workers to train, and supply chains to form. When those conditions exist, factories follow. When they don't, factories leave. For months, American trade policy stopped behaving like a framework and started behaving like a threat cycle. Tariffs announced, delayed, re-announced, redefined. Allies treated as leverage. Companies treated as instruments. And planning horizons reduced from decades to quarters. That shift matters more than any single tariff rate. Because once firms stop believing they can plan, they stop believing they should stay. General Motors did not wake up one morning and choose Canada. They arrived there step by step, calculation by calculation. And to see how that calculation formed, we need to go back before the announcement, before the filings, before the panic, to the policy choices that set this in motion. Every industrial shift has a history. And this one did not begin with a press conference or a tariff tweet. It began with a cycle, one the United States has entered before. Manufacturing depends on time, long time. 10, 20, 30 years of planning, compressed into spreadsheets, contracts, and expectations about the future. In the post-war era, America understood this. Policy was not perfect, but it was legible. Companies knew the rules well enough to commit capital and build ecosystems around them. That clarity began to erode when trade policy stopped being structural and started becoming tactical. Tariffs were no longer tools within a strategy. They became signals, sometimes warnings, sometimes punishments, sometimes leverage, often changing before their effects could even be measured. From an economic perspective, this is where the cycle turns dangerous. Volatility increases risk premiums. Risk premiums slow investment, slowed investment weakens domestic capacity, and weakened capacity invites more aggressive policy responses. It becomes a feedback loop. Uncertainty creates flight. Flight creates political anger. Anger produces more uncertainty. General Motors was operating inside that loop, watching it tighten, running scenarios where the costs kept rising but the rules never settled. And once a firm reaches that point, the question is no longer if they move. It's when the first real rupture didn't come with an announcement. It came with silence. In Detroit, silence is never neutral. When investment plans stop circulating, when site announcements pause, when executives stop reassuring and start calculating, that spring, the signals were unmistakable. Meetings moved behind closed doors, supply contracts were quietly revisited, consultants specializing in cross-border logistics were suddenly retained. None of this was public, none of it dramatic. But for those who understand industrial behavior, it was unmistakable. This was the moment the abstract became concrete. Tariff uncertainty was no longer a political debate. It was now a line item, a cost projection, a risk that could not be hedged. General Motors began modeling what another full cycle of unpredictability would mean, not just for profits, but for operational survival. And the numbers did not converge. For a company built in Flint, shaped by American labor, and woven into the identity of the middle class, this was not an emotional decision. It was a systemic one. The kind firms make only when every internal threshold has been crossed. This was mini crisis number one. The moment when waiting became more dangerous than moving. And once that realization sets in, the clock accelerates. Because when a corporation stops asking for clarity, it starts looking for exits. Here is the part most people miss. Capital does not move toward generosity. It moves toward systems. What General Motors encountered was not simply higher costs. It was a breakdown in the logic of the environment they were operating in. Tariffs were not embedded in a stable industrial policy. They were floating detached from timelines, from coordination, from any clear endpoint. For an automaker, that kind of ambiguity is toxic. A modern vehicle is not built in one place. It is assembled from thousands of components, crossing borders multiple times before a single car rolls off the line. When trade policy becomes unpredictable, every one of those crossings becomes a variable. And when variables multiply, planning collapses. This is the hidden mechanism, not ideology, not loyalty. But the math of supply chains, Canada understood this precisely. They didn't argue politics. They offered structure, a framework measured in years, not press cycles, predictable trade terms, regulatory continuity, workforce pipelines aligned with production timelines. In other words, they offered what Washington would not, certainty. Once that comparison became clear, the decision was no longer controversial. It was mechanical. A rational system responding to incentives as designed. And when systems realign, the consequences don't arrive slowly. They arrive all at once. The second rupture was louder, faster, impossible to ignore. Once the internal decision locked, everything accelerated. Filings appeared where there had been none for years. Meetings that once drifted now closed with signatures. Timelines collapsed from quarters into days. What looked sudden to the public was, in reality, a controlled release of pressure that had been building for months. This was mini crisis number two. The moment strategy becomes irreversible. Within hours of the announcement, the implications rippled outward. Planned expansions froze. Promised facilities entered limbo. Projects once described as anchors for the next generation of American manufacturing were suddenly conditional, not canceled. Worse, uncertain, and uncertainty at this stage spreads faster than any tariff. Washington reacted urgently because they understood what this represented. This was not symbolism. This was operational capital leaving the system. Components, production lines, research capacity, elements that, once relocated, do not easily return. General Motors moved first, but not blindly. The timing was precise, the sequence deliberate. They acted before conditions could be imposed, before negotiations could reopen, before uncertainty could be weaponized again. That speed matters because it signals confidence, not confidence in a country, confidence in a framework. And when a corporation demonstrates that level of clarity under pressure, others begin to recalculate immediately. What happened next was not panic. It was attention. And that attention would soon shift away from boardrooms and directly onto people. Now, I want you to think about this not as an analyst, but as a person. If you are a worker who was promised a job that no longer has a start date, if you trained for a plant that may never open, if you built a life around a factory that exists now only as a press release frozen in time, this is where policy stops being abstract. For you, uncertainty is not a talking point. It is a mortgage. A school district, a retirement you can no longer calculate. When capital pauses, workers absorb the shock first. Not because they failed, but because they are last in line when systems break. And when governments create volatility without protection, it is households, not balance sheets, that carry the cost. I've worked in countries where instability hollowed out the middle class. It never begins with collapse. It begins with promises quietly withdrawn, with timelines that slip, with "we'll see" replacing "you're hired." If this resonates with you, don't dismiss it as distant politics. Share this. Talk about it. Demand better questions from leaders who claim to speak for working people. Because when certainty disappears, it is never executives who lose sleep first. And once workers lose faith, rebuilding trust takes far longer than relocating capital. That human cost is why this story does not end at the factory gate. It expands across borders. What you are watching is not a bilateral dispute. It is a signal moving through the global system. When one advanced economy demonstrates that it cannot offer policy stability, capital doesn't just leave that country. It recalibrates everywhere. Trade partners reassess exposure. Allies hedge their commitments. Competitors sharpen their offers. Canada understood this moment not as a transaction, but as positioning. By locking in long-term guarantees, they didn't just attract one investment. They broadcasted a message to global markets. This is a jurisdiction where planning still works. And markets listen. Supply chains that shift north do not stop at the border. They pull talent, research capacity, and supplier ecosystems with them. Universities adjust. Logistics hubs realign. Over time, gravity takes over. For the United States, this creates a strategic dilemma. Industrial leadership is not lost in a single decision. It erodes through accumulation. One facility, one lab, one supplier network at a time. This is how competitiveness actually moves in the modern world. Not through declarations, but through quiet, compounding advantages. And once that process begins, reversing it requires more than anger. It requires coherence. Which brings us to the hardest question of all. What happens next? From here, the future does not move in a straight line. It branches. There are 3 paths ahead, and none of them are abstract. The first is correction. The administration recognizes that unpredictability is not leverage, it is erosion. Policy becomes legible again. Trade tools are embedded inside a long-term industrial strategy. Certainty returns slowly, then unevenly, but enough to stop the bleeding. In this scenario, GM's move becomes a warning shot, not a turning point. The second path is stagnation. Rhetoric softens, but structure does not change. Tariffs remain flexible, rules remain conditional, companies hedge rather than flee, but they no longer commit. Investment becomes defensive. The system doesn't collapse, but it stops renewing itself. This is how leadership fades without drama. The third path is escalation. Pressure replaces reform. Threats substitute for planning. And firms, already shown an exit, begin to use it. One move becomes precedent, precedent becomes pattern, and pattern becomes decline. History is clear on this point. Nations do not lose competitiveness because others cheat. They lose it when they stop governing their own systems coherently. The tragedy is that none of these outcomes are inevitable. They are choices made quietly in policy rooms, long before workers feel them. Which is why this moment matters more than any single investment. It is not about where capital went. It is about whether the system that lost it is willing to change. Let me leave you with the insight that policymakers often learn too late. Capital does not punish countries. It responds to them. It responds to coherence, to predictability, to governments that understand that strength is not noise, it is structure. What happened here was not a loss of pride. It was a loss of trust. And trust, once broken, does not return with press releases or insults. It returns with rules that hold, commitments that last, and policies that survive beyond a news cycle. General Motors did not make history by leaving. They revealed history in motion. They showed that in the modern economy, loyalty ends where uncertainty begins. That middle-class prosperity is not defended by threats, but by systems that allow people and capital to plan a future together. If this analysis helped you see the deeper mechanics behind the headlines, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Continue the conversation. Demand more than rhetoric from those who shape economic destiny. Because this story is not over. The next 30 days will matter. The next decisions will compound. And the question that remains is simple, but unforgiving. Will America compete with strategy or continue to compete with chaos? I'll be watching. And if you want to understand what comes next, stay here.